there are a lot of superheroes between Marvel and DC Comics. Like, too many to name. It would take us forever, right? But we all love the Hulk. We all love Spider Man. We all love Superman and Wolverine. How much do we love the characters that have taken after them? The ones who have assumed their moniker and are essentially copycats, derivatives of the OG heroes that we love. This is not a new practice, of course. There's been Wally West for many, many years. We've had various versions of Superman for many, many years. So it's an old thing, but it has gotten unwieldy, let's say, over the last 20 or so years. Maybe to me, but what about to you? That's what we're going to talk about. I want to know from you guys, do you feel like there are too many copycat heroes? Does it bother you at all? And do you care about those derivative characters?
So for me, a big recent one is Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Um, with the Spider-Verse stuff exploding in popularity over the past few years, it feels like everything is Spider-Verse now. Um, and for the most part, I don't mind them. I like Spider Gwen. I like I like Miles. I like Spider-Man 2099 and the various incarnations of Spider-Man that have sort of come before. But there have been a couple of developments here that I think this will set the table well enough. A couple of uh things have happened recently that have really tipped this, especially in the case of Spider-Man, that's made it really annoying to me. So Spider-Gwen uh came around in the first wave of the Spider-Verse stuff. Exploded in popularity, got her own line in a different universe, became a mainstay in the films. Now she's crossing over to exist in the main Marvel canon. I think that's annoying as hell because she's Gwen Stacy, but she's also not Gwen Stacy. She has her own history. She has her own rich, tapestry of other characters and other version of events that have happened to her, that are all interesting and just forgotten. And it's a world that we can't live in. So now she has to come over to 616. I think it's annoying as piss. The second thing is Dan Slott has created Spider Boy, which is Peter Parker's forgotten sidekick. And I just cannot abide. He has actual spider powers. If I'm not mistaken, he's been genetically altered to have the powers of a spider in that he can bite people and he turns into a spider. I just can't. It's the stuff that people hate Robin for. Robin being Batman's sidekick.
Right.
It's hokey and I find it annoying and it's such a blatant hash grab for me that this is my line.
Yeah, I think the spider people you call out is probably the on the more egregious end. I think in terms of how you'll create derivative characters and only maybe use them for an arc or a few issues and kind of do away with it, it diminishes the purpose of even creating them. And I think it also diminishes the value of the copycat of the copy from which they're made. It's like if I can iterate on this, maybe unsuccessfully or successfully, whatever it might be, the fact that I'm iterating on it means that maybe I don't have faith in that individual character. And I think it bothers me from that standpoint. Like, I don't mind if there's necessarily another spider person, because I'm in that same example, right? Thinking of the Spider Verse, I thought that was goofy, and I don't think that in mass it takes away from Peter Parker until somebody replaces that character, and so until somebody replaces Peter Parker as the Spider-Man mantle holistically. But if it's a sort of spin-off, then I think it's like, okay, I can accept that it'll exist elsewhere and outside of what matters to me in that moment.
So like the clone Ben Riley replacing Peter Parker.
Yeah, that becomes the issue, because it's like, well, then if you can so easily swap out Peter Parker, the Spider-Man, then you're diminishing the value of Spider-Man, and you're not necessarily elevating Ben Riley.
Okay.
So I think it's important to establish why these characters get made in the first place. You know, what it is that Marvel and DC are trying to do when they take one of their characters and spin them off into a character wearing a very similar costume with the same name, and, you know, maybe is a gender swap or maybe isn't. So when I think about that, I think about characters like Wally West. I think about characters like Supergirl. I think about characters like Superboy. I think about characters like She-Hulk, right? Spider, take your pick. And I think they often exist for a handful of reasons. One of them is to appeal to a younger audience. I think, you know, Cale, you would be more of a Flash expert certainly than me. And I think that Wally was introduced to be like a younger Flash, so that, okay, the older people have Barry or whatever, people that like Barry grew up with him. And then now for the new generation of Wally. And that almost feels like a DC tradition to some degree. You know, Superman, we got Supergirl. Supergirl hopefully appeals to women, but also probably a lot more appeals to younger boys who, you know, love Superman and is great, but they want some boobs, right? So I think it's oftentimes that to fulfill a need that they see potentially exists. And hey, yeah, we could create a new character, but what would be better than, why would we create a new character when we could just make another Flash? You know, new characters are hard to get over. But if it's the Flash, but he's just a kid, well, that's great. Or, you know, in the case of like a Miles Morales, you know, he serves multiple functions. He's a kid, right? And so you get your old, not that he was created for this reason, but you get your older Peter, but then you also have your young kid who can have high school Spider-Man experiences. But then he's also Black and Spanish. So you get the diversity aspect as well. And there are stories that, you know, are going to be different for him than Peter that will appeal, hopefully, to different kinds of people, right? So to me, that's the big idea behind it. That's why it gets done. I am not the biggest fan of it. I think that sometimes it's done in ways that are meaningful and really additive. Like, I think Miles was additive. I think, you know, obviously a lot of the older ones like Wally and Supergirl, very additive. But I look at some of the more modern ones, and it's like there are maybe 10 Superman versions of varying degrees.
Sure.
He's got kids that are super powered that are his. He's got a kid that's his, and then kids that he adopted that have essentially the same powers, and then all the multiversal ones and everything else. And so for me, when I read these Superman comics, right, loving everything Philip Kennedy Johnson did, the hardest part for me to accept is that there are all these super people and that there are any problems at all in Metropolis. I also think it takes away from the importance and how special it is that someone like Superman exists in the world, right? Like, he's the one defender. He is the person who can take on all comers and is going to defend this earth with his last breath, no matter the threat. Well, all right. I mean, you've got a Justice League of your own kin now. Do you really even need to be that active?
Hmm.
SpiderMan, a singular event. He gets bitten by a spider. How many fucking spiders are running around biting people and turning them into super people?
Well, and admittedly, like they found weird ways to sort of get around that part, right? The only time that was actually like copied, where it was like somehow the same spider or a different spider of the same lab experiment or whatever, I think is Miles. And he came from an alternate universe where that Peter Parker was, bitten by the same spider or the same.
Yeah, same idea.
So I think at least they've been at least reasonably creative with how they've copied it.
I think something you brought up, Sean, with regards to the Superman family, from an executional standpoint, I think it also gets in the way of storytelling. I think one of the biggest critiques that we had for parts of PKJ's run most recently was, when do I just get to see Superman stuff? Why do I have to incorporate the family into things? Similarly with Spider-Man, why do I have to incorporate the whole breadth of family? Why can't I get the singular titular character in a singular titular book? It has the namesake, but I have to deal with all these other people. And the Flash right now, right, is having a similar problem. You have so many of these other characters sort of come out of the woodwork that, sure, maybe they work with respect to the narrative being told, but I also want the guy on the cover to be, who I'm following, and that becomes frustrating when I don't get the payoff for an individual and I have to get the payoff for a group. If I'm gonna get a payoff for that, give me a book that is specific to the family, because I'll have and manage my expectations, as opposed to having to sift through the individual elements of, oh, this is the part where it becomes about him, and then this is the part where it becomes about his family, and I have to mix and match that.
Yeah. And I think there's something you gain, a Superman family, but then I think there's also something you lose, which is that focus on Superman, who is the reason that we're here to that particular book for the most part. Um, I think about the Hulk when it relates to this, like in the
Yeah.
negative a lot, because the Hulk for me is like, wow, this is a guy who had a very, very specific and unique thing happen. Somehow he survived a gamma bomb and turned into a rage monster. And I feel like that would not happen again. And I don't know how all of the other Hulks came to be. We've got She-Hulk, we've got Amadeus Cho's totally awesome Hulk, we have the Red Hulk. And,
Yeah,
to me,
the red She-Hulk.
the Red She-Hulk, yeah, absolutely.
Was there a blue Hulk?
I don't remember. But then you even have, well, yeah, like it just feels like a lot. And I think for me, the Hulk lost a little bit when Totally Awesome Hulk was running around.
Yeah. Because it's like, especially for the Hulk, like you say, it's like it's a very unique problem that, like, okay, I can stretch this far. And then She-Hulk gets her thing from like a blood transfusion because, however it worked out, Bruce Banner was the only person that could, give her, could save her life. So be like, well, okay, all right, that's a fine. But then you have Red Hulk, and it's like, hold on a second. And Red Hulk also just happens to be like his arch nemesis or whatever. Come on.
And on top of that, one of the things that really frustrates me is that the Hulk has a fatal flaw, which is that, Bruce Banner is like a genius scientist, has a lot to contribute to the world, but he's angry. And this thing that happened to him now makes manifest his anger. It personifies his anger and rage into the Hulk, in the Hulk. That's what we get. And so She-Hulk, she doesn't have that problem. Jennifer Walters is able to live her life as a lawyer happily, really without the She-Hulk. Like, there's no downside for her. She can be She-Hulk, she can be Jennifer Walters. It's really all good. But it's not all good for Bruce. And I think that's compelling. Whereas She-Hulk loses a little bit by not having that, which is why the Mariko Tamaki She-Hulk run that featured She-Hulk in the role was amazing, because she did have to deal with that. Red Hulk doesn't have any problems. He's just a villain Hulk.
Yeah.
That's not totally awesome. Hulk was just Amadeus Cho, smartest dude, being a dude, bro, while he's the Hulk.
When I think you have, especially with the Hulk, you have clever twists on it where like the Hulk will be able to tap into Bruce's intelligence, and that's where you get like the Gray Hulk, that is smarter and figures out how to manipulate things and becomes like a gangster or whatever, you know. Um, and even stuff like with She-Hulk, even the TV show, I think the one thing they did that was fairly interesting was they added the anger of existing as a woman in modern society.
Yeah, yeah.
And she has to really work with that to keep that under control so that she doesn't become an absolute rage monster. I thought that was really clever. The rest of the show, I think you can, say a lot about, but that's not this one.
For characters that don't have that, and I think when you mentioned the Gray Hulk, those transformations I think feel different because they're still technically the same character, but it feels like character growth to some degree, or there's a level at which you can vary who the individual becomes within the context of the same story that you're writing. I think of there's this Nancy Collins run on Swamp Thing where he becomes like not metal, but like he just gets long hair, very 80s, 90s rock, and he becomes almost like poisonous and binds as opposed to earthy and whatever. All that to say that the character changes and transforms physically to mimic some other kind of Swamp Thing, but the story associated to it is one of rejection that reflects the individual character, that one of
It's his story.
pain. Yeah, it's his story. It's still his story.
Yeah.
And I think that works for the sake of being able to transform and quote unquote introduce a new version of the character.
Yeah, and I feel like that's super different.
Sure.
And that's, totally fine and acceptable. But Swamp Thing, to use that character, is an example of where I have no issue with this whatsoever. Because Swamp Thing, there are multiple people who have been Swamp Thing. The difference to me is that's almost like being possessed, in the sense that you are not deciding like, yeah, I'm gonna suit up and be a hero, and or something like that. Like, Swamp Thing is just it's not tethered to a person. It's an idea more so, I think.
Sure.
And so that doesn't bother me.
Similar to Green Lantern, I think is a case where that works really well.
Oh.
Does it work the same way when you make that argument with a character like Thor? Because if you remember when Jane Foster became Thor, one of the big pieces of conversation was, no, this Thor, the one who carries this hammer, is the title of the person carrying the hammer. It just so happens that the last guy, his name was Thor.
I thought that was Stin.
Oh.
I buy it, but it doesn't fill me with confidence.
Yeah, that frustrated me, and Jason Aaron's run ended up being great, and I really don't have a problem at all with Jane Foster being Thor.
Yeah.
But I just don't get that, because the power of Thor is, Thor is Thor. So
he still had that power.
Right.
Yeah.
And he still had the power. He was still Thor. So what happened there?
Uh, to that Green Lantern piece, though, now that I'm thinking about it, how does that work? And maybe this is outside of the confines of comics necessarily, but just let's say like in media, the Power Rangers, like there are multiple versions of the red and the green and the black and the white, like all that still exists, but they feel like different eras, and that still works as being multiple and iterative of the characters, but like different forms.
You're taking us in a totally different direction, bro. Go
I
ahead,
can
Joe.
I could I could go off on that for a while, but to answer the question, I'm going to pivot slightly to Ultraman, because if you look at Ultraman, you look at a diagram of all the Ultramans that have ever existed, they look almost the exact same.
Mm.
But they are very different. They're all wildly different. And the thing is that, a new one comes out every year. At the end of each series, the Ultraman and, his human counterpart take off into the universe because the kaiju threat on Earth has been uh, defeated, or whatever. And Ultraman sort of exists in this sort of pocket dimension where his people sort of watch over all of the universes, and there are several, and they all come from different families and stuff.
Mm.
Interesting.
So that's how I view sort of the Power Rangers thing, and Kamen Rider to a certain degree. Like, they'll tie those threads very, very loosely, but if you start pulling them, you're gonna unravel that sweater.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
We haven't mentioned Batman yet. And Batman is an interesting one because Batman, there are other Batmen now more recently, like Jace Fox
Mm.
is Batman as well. And Batman is an idea. It's a costume. It's a title. Um, but what I have a problem with is that the circumstances that make Bruce Wayne Batman are very specific, and like I think it cheapens the idea of Batman if another person can have that same level of commitment and drive to this idea that crime needs to be eradicated, because Bruce is almost pathologically driven to do this. Like he's got something going on in his mind that I just don't feel like would be replicatable. And
Mm.
he's got all these wards, which is how they've gotten around for decades, having to introduce new Batman. They just say, "Oh, this is Dick Grayson, Robin." He's a ward of Bruce and his sidekick. But of course, these are all like just younger versions of Batman, more or less.
Mhm.
And I've always been silently frustrated by the fact that there have been attempts to elevate those characters to the same level of Batman, because to me, that cheapens the idea. Nightwing's now the best fighter. Tim's the best detective. To me, Batman is those things, and everybody else has to be under that. And if they're not, then why is Batman required? If SheHulk is as strong as the Hulk and doesn't have his fatal flaw, why do we need the Hulk? That's what I come to with these things, and that's one of the reasons why I get so frustrated by them.
So how do you feel about Batman Inc.?
So I enjoyed the concept because Morrison was doing it, but I specifically remember at the time it was announced being really unhappy. Really, really, really unhappy, because I just don't think it makes any sense, especially in the context of that run, which I won't go into too much, but we see how they tried to replicate Batman during Grant's run, and it created awful, despicable people. Remember the ghosts of Batman that Dr. Hurt tried
Oh,
to.
yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So that showed me, and Azrael was a horrible, despicable person. That shows me that what the trauma that Bruce has, he is uniquely capable of holding that and using that as fuel for his crusade, and that no one else can do that.
Mm. Mm.
I think I agree with you to a certain extent. But I think that's also where Batman is a unique case, where Gotham City has to become a character in Batman's mythos. So when you get someone like the Batman copycat, was it Night Runner in Paris?
I don't remember the names.
He's a Batman of Paris that sort of takes up the mantle to protect Paris, and he was one of the guys in Batman Inc. that was stationed as a Batman all over the world, and there was one in Tokyo, there's one in London, etc. I think the central Batman being Bruce Wayne has to be in Gotham, because Gotham is a hell unto its own. And I think the idea of other Batman in other cities sort of makes sense, because maybe at a certain point the villains will stop coming. There'll still be street crime, there'll still be whatever, but they're not going to have the Joker, right? I think for me, Bruce Wayne exists because of Gotham and the psychology that lives in that place. It's the most intense place that needs the most intense Batman.
So you're saying that the idea that the lesser Batmen are around the world doing what they do elsewhere in places that don't have the kinds of super crime that Gotham has, it's acceptable that they are lesser Batmen because they're needed less than Batman is needed in Gotham.
Yeah, I think it's fine to be inspired by Batman, but listen, you can't be Batman. And I think Azrael proves that. He took it and went insane.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a good place to leave it. I think, ultimately, if your favorite version of, let's say, the Hulk is the totally awesome Hulk or She-Hulk, it's completely valid. This conversation was not to invalidate anything like that. It's just really to say, like, hey, comics have been around a really long time. There are all these different versions of these characters. How does that play? How do we feel about that? How does that impact our view of the OG? And in my opinion, nothing will ever be as good as the original. But we leave the final word up to you all. What do you think about this? Let us know in the comments. Leave us a like. Subscribe if you're not. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you in the next one. Take care, guys.